As I've been reflecting today on what it means to celebrate Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I keep coming back to what it was like to walk up the steps of the Capitol on opening day of legislative session this year, and finding that as we approached the Capitol, it was surrounded by the National Guard. And through barricades on all sides, we were surrounded by state troops, watching armed white supremacists yelling from the other side of the fences. It reminds me of a little girl named Ruby Bridges. She was also escorted by the National Guard up the steps of her elementary school in Little Rock, Arkansas. How could any of us forget those little feet walking up those steps? She too had to face white supremacists and barricades, and they yelled at her as she just tried to go to school. And yet that little girl, Ruby, took that walk to school day after day after day. For her, it was a walk of justice, and was for her a walk amongst violence, just as it was for us the first day of legislative session. I have a daughter the same age as Ruby. Ruby was 6 years old, and my daughter's 5. I think also of my parents and grandparents who would have been the age to walk with the 250,000 who marched on Washington with Dr. King. Many of us watched as neighbors march this summer, and I, with hundreds of neighbors, hundreds of thousands across the nation, marched day after day after day, the same way our parents did, the same way our grandparents did, as we again marched for Black lives. 2020 was a moment of clarity. We need to look at the truth that's before us, and we need to look at it and be unflinching and unwavering. We have to continue to look at the truth that we saw as white nationalists stormed our Capitol in Washington, D.C., and also as they approached our Capitol here in our Washington. And those white nationalists in D.C. forced their way into our Capitol, and we saw our elected officials cowered in fear. I know it's easy to sit in fear. It's easy to assume we don't have any way out of this. It feels hopeless and powerless. But we're not powerless, and we certainly have hope. We will not let hate win, just as our parents and our grandparents did not before us. We'll continue to fight until we win, just as our grandparents and our parents fought to win civil rights. And it's why we acknowledge those who came before us, those who are no longer with us. It's why in the Black Lives Matter movement we say their names. It's why we remember Breonna Taylor and Charlene Lyles and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Manuel Ellis and Eric Garner and Che Taylor. It's why we continue to honor the Black women who stood next to Dr. King, who worked tirelessly, endlessly, and thanklessly. It's why we honor children and the women who fought for democracy in Georgia, the women who fought for the victory of Reverend Warnock, the first Black senator of Georgia, who preached at the same church as Dr. King, Ebenezer Baptist Church. We honor women like the good Senator Tawana Nobles in the 28th, who's the first Black senator to serve in our state in a decade, and the good representatives alongside me, April Berg in the 30th, and Jamila Taylor in the 44th. Our Black Members Caucus here in Washington State has doubled in size. We are joining Black colleagues who were here before us, many of whom have been here alone at times, who fought the good fight for us and have welcomed us into the fold and into the work. We must continue to acknowledge the Black women and men of our legislature and throughout the country and in every corner of this state who know it's possible, who know that when we come together, liberty is possible. And this walk towards liberty is not a walk or a burden Black people can walk alone. Black people are whole, and we are strong, and we are resilient, but we are not a monolith. and we cannot alone break the chains that others have put upon us. We all must act together towards freedom. And from those who came before us in the civil rights movement, we know and we have seen our Black brothers and sisters stand beside our white brothers and sisters and siblings and accomplices, standing shoulder to shoulder with us. And we know from those who came before us that we must continue to march, that we must continue to fight for our children, we must continue to fight for our democracy, we must continue to fight for our future, for everyone's future. Because Dr. King's legacy is not the eloquence of his words. His legacy is the conviction of his actions. And that every step he took with others towards our shared freedom. Will you take that step with us now? We are lawmakers. We have to know that too often laws are not about justice. They're just about power. Will we stand up and write the laws that can be both, to write justice into existence? Will you stand shoulder to shoulder with Black people, our families, our children? Will you shield us from violence? Will you step in front of others to protect us from those who would harm us just because of the color of our skin? Justice was not present when the National Guard had to escort a little girl, Ruby, up the steps of a public school. And true justice will not arrive until the National Guard does not have to escort Black lawmakers like my colleagues and me up the steps of our state capitol to do our work for you, our neighbors here in Washington. As we consider our walk toward justice together, I want to leave you with the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., words he spoke from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial at the March on Washington in 1963. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must take the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who ask the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? No. No. We are not satisfied. And we will not be satisfied until justice rolls like water and righteousness like a heavy stream.